I grew up in northern Michigan, near the Upper Peninsula, where thunderstorms aren't always frequent, but when they come, they hit hard. I've been camping in those woods since I was a kid, hiking, fishing, hunting, learning to read the land, the weather, and how far you can push yourself without getting into serious trouble. I never thought a storm could turn a familiar trail into something unrecognizable until the weekend this story begins. I was 31 at the time. With a small group of friends from work, we decided to go camping for the weekend. The kind of weekend where you pack heavy backpacks, tents, and enough supplies to last 3 days, and aim for isolation. The destination was a state-managed forest with trails that few locals use. My plan was simple: get away, fish the lakes, hike to some known viewpoints, and relax. We arrived Friday afternoon. Clear sky, warm, sunny, light breeze. The drive-in was long, dirt and gravel roads for miles. We picked a spot near a lake, set up tents, and started a small fire. By 5 p.m., everything was settled. We had planned to hike a short trail, just enough to explore before the evening, then cook dinner and sit by the fire. The first hint of trouble came around 6:30 p.m. Clouds began rolling in from the west, low and dark, almost slate-colored. It wasn't unusual. Storms can move quickly in Michigan, but there was a weight to these clouds. You could feel it in your chest and your limbs. My experience told me to check radar on my phone. Coverage was spotty in that forest, but I got a rough image. There was a large system moving fast, with high probability of heavy rain and wind. I told the group we should head back to camp, secure everything, and prepare for a possible overnight storm. Most laughed it off. "It's just a little rain," someone said. I insisted. I've learned not to argue with instinct in the woods during storm season. By 7:15, the wind picked up. The trees swayed aggressively. I began noticing branches bending unnaturally. Leaves were coming off. By 7:30, the first drops of rain hit. Not heavy yet, but steady. The lake began to ripple under the wind. Around 7:45, we were all back at camp. Tents zipped, fire smoldering. That's when it hit. Not a single lightning strike at first, just a sudden, deafening roll of thunder, low and constant, vibrating the ground. The storm was closer than radar suggested. Then the rain intensified. Sheets of water fell sideways, gusts bending saplings at the edge of the lake. By 8 o'clock, the forest around us was nearly dark, despite it being early evening. The rain obscured everything beyond 20 feet. Visibility was limited, and the familiar trails vanished under the sheets of water. The fire had gone out. We huddled in tents, trying to keep dry. Then I noticed movement. Not the trees in the wind, not animals, something human-shaped, pacing along the far edge of the lake. The rain made it hard to see clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. Standing upright, walking slowly, sometimes stopping. It was too large to be a deer, too deliberate for a raccoon. I called out. Nothing. No response. It stopped at the treeline, as if watching. My friends insisted it was a park ranger or another camper, but I knew there were no other campers in that area. We were alone. By 9 o'clock, the storm intensified further. Wind gusts strong enough to push us sideways. Branches snapped near the tents. Rainwater pooled around the campsite. We decided to evacuate to my truck, parked about half a mile away along the trailhead. The plan was simple. Stick together, move slowly, avoid the lake and swampy areas. We left at 9:10. Visibility was almost zero. Headlamps barely penetrated the sheets of rain. The trail became a stream, water flowing over roots and rocks. Every step was calculated, careful, slow. That's when I noticed the figure again. It wasn't following exactly, but it was present. Always at the edge of visibility, sometimes closer than I expected. It never moved in a natural way. No stepping over roots, no slowing for water, It just appeared along the path or near trees. I tried to get closer, shouted, but nothing. By 9:45, the group was beginning to panic. One friend slipped in the mud, nearly twisting an ankle. Another started crying quietly, overwhelmed by the storm and darkness. I tried to reassure them. "Keep moving, stick together," I said. "We'll get out." Around 10 o'clock, we reached a fork in the trail I thought I knew. Under normal conditions, it's a simple left turn to the parking area. That night, in the rain and darkness, I couldn't find it. Every tree, every branch looked the same. Every puddle reflected the gray sky. Every bend in the trail felt like it led back to the campsite. That's when the figure reappeared, closer, standing directly in the middle of what should have been the trail. I shined my headlamp, and for a moment, I saw nothing but outline. A tall, pale, human shape. No facial features, no clothing detail. Just standing, watching, waiting. I told everyone to stay calm, back up slightly, and we tried to go around. The figure didn't move. As we shifted left, right, anything, it adjusted perfectly. Not like a person walking. It was like the space itself allowed it to stay between us and the exit. The storm raged on, rainwater rising, wind tearing branches, the lake now lapping dangerously close to areas that should have been dry. By 10:30, my phone had no signal. No way to call for help. No way to see the storm's movement. The darkness, the rain, the water, all of it was disorienting. Hours passed. Each step became heavier. We slipped repeatedly. At one point, I noticed deep impressions in the mud along the trail. Too big for any of us. Too deep for a human footprint. They started behind us, parallel to the trail, not left or right, directly following our path. By midnight, fatigue had set in. We rested briefly near a fallen tree, huddled for warmth. The figure was still present, still at the periphery of vision. It never approached, but never left. The storm hadn't eased at all. If anything, the wind picked up further. Around 1 a.m., we finally reached a clearing that resembled the parking area. The truck was barely visible. My headlights cut through the rain, revealing the mud-slicked path. Relief should have washed over us. Instead, the figure appeared one final time, standing at the tree-line behind the truck. Then it disappeared. We got into the truck, drenched, exhausted, shaking. Engine started, lights on, slowly navigating the slippery road back to civilization. No one spoke much. Everyone was silently processing what had happened. Later, when the storm cleared and we returned to the campsite in daylight, there was no sign of the figure, no footprints, no evidence of anyone else being in the forest. Just flattened branches from wind, mud, and storm debris. But we all knew what we saw. Years later, I still avoid that trail during storms. I avoid that forest at night when clouds roll in. I don't hike alone anymore in bad weather. The figure wasn't human, not entirely. The storm didn't just block our way. It made us vulnerable to something that watches when you think you're safe. I've told friends, law enforcement, even rangers. Most dismiss it as stress, disorientation, exhaustion. I don't care. I know what I saw. And I know storms in those woods don't just bring rain. They bring things that don't belong. I've lived in central Tennessee my whole life, in a small town wedged between the hills and the Cumberland Plateau. My parents taught me to respect storms, not just the obvious dangers like lightning or flooding, but the subtle ones. The way storms change the land, the way they make familiar places feel foreign, the way they isolate you. I never realized how isolated you could feel until the storm I'm about to recount. It was late May. I was 33 at the time, single, and had decided to take a solo weekend trip to a cabin I rented in a remote hollow. I'd done this a dozen times before, hiking, fishing, or just getting away from phones, traffic, and obligations. This time, I was hoping for peace, a weekend to reset. The drive in on Friday afternoon was uneventful. Clear skies, light wind, the usual Tennessee hills. By the time I reached the cabin mid-afternoon, clouds had begun to gather in the distance to the west. Nothing alarming. I unpacked, checked the propane, set up a small fire outside on the porch, and decided to take a short hike along the trail behind the cabin. The trail was familiar, just a loop, maybe a mile or two, mostly flat, with a creek crossing. By 5 p.m., the clouds had thickened. The sky was a dull green-gray, the kind that makes the forest feel darker even before the sun sets. Birds and insects were quiet. The air was heavy and humid. I noticed small drops of rain starting to fall, lightly at first. I checked the forecast on my phone. Radar showed a cluster of thunderstorms moving eastward, predicted to reach the area by early evening. I didn't think much of it. I returned to the cabin and made some food. By 6 o'clock, the wind had picked up. Small branches snapped and fell across the porch. The first heavy drops of rain started hitting the roof. I went inside, thinking it would pass quickly. By 6:30, the storm had intensified. Sheets of water fell, steady and cold. The forest around the cabin looked distorted through the rain, trees blending together. The trail I had hiked earlier barely visible. Thunder rolled constantly, low and resonant. I stayed near the window, watching. That's when I noticed movement near the edge of the creek. A figure, tall, pale, standing perfectly still, partially obscured by trees. I froze. I rationalized a deer, maybe a large dog, pass by, but something about it didn't feel right. It was vertical, upright, unnaturally still. I grabbed binoculars. Nothing, just a shadow. By 7 o'clock, the wind had intensified further. Rain came down horizontally. My generator wasn't working. The cabin's lights flickered and then went out completely. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had effectively isolated me. I paced inside, trying to calm myself. Around 7:30, I saw the figure again, closer to the cabin now. It hadn't moved naturally to get there. It was just there. I tried to take a photo through the window. Nothing captured, just an indistinct blur in the rain. I considered leaving. The road in and out was dirt and gravel, steep in places. Water was pooling in the hollows, and the storm showed no sign of slowing. By 8 o'clock, the creek behind the cabin had risen dangerously. I realized that even if I left now, I could get trapped on the road, or worse, swept away in the water. The figure stayed at the edge of the trees, never coming closer, never retreating. It didn't move naturally, just existed at the boundary of my perception. I tried to rationalize. Maybe someone had been hiking and sought shelter. Maybe it was a projection of my mind, stressed and isolated. I shook it off and went back inside. By 9 o'clock, the storm became relentless. Rain so heavy it sounded like hammering on the roof. Wind that bent trees and stripped leaves off branches. I secured everything in the cabin, tried to keep the fire alive for light and warmth. Every few minutes, I'd glance outside. The figure remained unchanged, at the same distance, always watching. Around 10 o'clock, exhaustion started setting in. I hadn't eaten much. The storm had been going for hours, and I couldn't see an end. I tried to rest, lying on the bed near the window, but couldn't sleep. Every gust of wind, every branch breaking, every ripple on the creek kept me alert. By midnight, the water from the creek had started creeping toward the foundation. I stacked firewood and furniture as a makeshift barrier, trying to prevent flooding inside. I kept checking the window. The figure hadn't moved. It was still there, still pale, still human-shaped, but without detail, standing at the boundary where forest met water. I started to notice subtle signs, impressions in the muddy bank near the creek, not footprints exactly, but depressions and patterns I couldn't explain. They appeared as though whatever was there had been moving along the edge of the water. By 1:30 a.m., I realized I was trapped. Roads were likely flooded. The creek could rise further. I had no signal. Food was limited. Water from rain was dripping through parts of the roof where shingles were old. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Around 2 o'clock, I finally got my flashlight and cautiously stepped outside to check the creek. Water was high, flowing faster than I'd seen in years. The figure was gone. For the first time, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then I heard a sound, a soft shift, not footsteps, not anything natural. I froze. Wind, branches, something else. I turned slowly. The figure was back, now slightly closer to the cabin, standing under a tree. No movement, no expression, just present. Hours passed in this tense observation. The storm continued relentlessly. By 4 a.m., daylight was approaching, though the clouds kept the forest in dim gray. I stayed awake the entire time, watching the creek, the trees, the figure. Every time I glanced away, it seemed to shift subtly. I tried to rationalize, but the logic wouldn't stick. At 6 a.m., the storm finally began to taper off. Rain slowed. Wind dropped. The creek receded. I carefully stepped outside, inspected the area. The figure was gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing left. Only flattened branches and water damage. I stayed at the cabin the rest of the morning, documenting everything in notes and photos. Nothing appeared in the images, but the memory of the figure stayed clear. When I returned home later that day, friends and neighbors laughed at the story. I don't care. I've never forgotten it. The storm didn't just isolate me. It placed me in a moment where I could see something, or be seen by something, that existed outside normal perception. I don't go to that hollow anymore during storms. I never sleep in isolated cabins when the forecast predicts heavy rain. I still check weather reports obsessively. The storm didn't harm me physically, but it changed my understanding of what storms can bring and how alone and exposed you can be when the world outside shifts in ways you don't understand. I grew up in West Virginia, on the edge of a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. I know the roads, the hollows, the steep ridges, and the old bridges that feel solid but aren't always reliable during storms. I've driven them in heavy rain, snow, ice, and fog. I've been through plenty of thunderstorms, but nothing I experienced compares to the night I'm about to recount. It was early June. I was 34 and had agreed to take a solo trip into the mountains for a weekend to get away from work and the city. My plan was simple. Drive in Friday afternoon, set up camp near a ridge overlooking a hollow, spend the night in my small camper, hike the next day, and return Sunday. I was prepared. Full tank of gas, extra food, flashlights, first aid kit, and my experience in the mountains. I left town around 2 p.m. Friday. Roads were clear, sky mostly sunny. By the time I reached the entrance to the forest road, dirt, narrow, twisting, clouds had begun forming to the west. Nothing alarming, just the usual buildup for early summer storms. I thought little of it. By 4:30 p.m., I had reached my camping spot. A small clearing on a ridge, old fire pit, enough space for my camper. The view overlooked a hollow with a creek winding through. The air was humid, carrying the smell of wet earth and leaves. I unpacked, set up, and took a short walk along the edge of the ridge, just to stretch my legs. By 5:30, the sky had turned that ominous green-gray that precedes severe storms. I had seen it plenty of times, but I didn't like it. The trees bent with wind, the light dimmed unnaturally, and the birds were silent. I checked radar on my phone. Coverage was spotty, but the images showed a severe thunderstorm forming faster than expected. I decided to return to the camper and secure everything. By 6 o'clock, rain started lightly. By 6:15, it intensified into sheets, moving almost horizontally with the wind. The hollow below the ridge started filling with mist rising from the creek. I noticed movement near the tree line across the hollow. A figure, tall, human-shaped, standing perfectly still. I froze. I considered my experience. Storms can make shadows appear strange. I rationalized it as a tree, a stump, a trick of light, but it didn't move. By 6:45, the wind had picked up. The camper rocked slightly on its tires. The rain intensified. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Thunder rolled constantly, low and resonant. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the ridge and the hollow in stark bursts. Each flash revealed a figure, still standing at the same spot, sometimes partially hidden, sometimes fully visible. By 7:30, the storm was relentless. I checked the creek. It had begun rising, water already pooling in areas that should have been dry. I considered leaving, but the road leading in was slick, narrow, and muddy. It wouldn't be safe to drive in these conditions. I stayed, huddled in the camper, watching the storm and the figure. By 8 o'clock, fatigue began setting in. I hadn't eaten much. The camper's small propane heater was barely keeping the chill at bay. I noticed subtle sounds, branches snapping, water rushing in unseen channels, the occasional scrape against the camper. I glanced outside. The figure had shifted, closer to the tree line near the road. It wasn't advancing, but it had repositioned itself. By 9 o'clock, the rain had turned into sheets of water, falling like walls. Wind bent trees at dangerous angles. I realized the ridge could become unstable. Mudslides are common in this area after prolonged storms. I secured the camper further, but the ground beneath my feet was already saturated. At 10 o'clock, the storm intensified further. I had been watching the figure for hours. It didn't blink, didn't move naturally. It simply existed at the boundary where the trees met the road, perfectly still, observing. I felt watched, truly watched, in a way that made my skin crawl. I considered leaving, but the road was becoming impassable. I had no choice but to wait. Hours passed. Rain and wind continued with no letup. By midnight, the creek below the ridge had risen dangerously, water seeping into the hollow, flooding minor trails. I could see debris floating past if I peered through the camper's small window. The figure remained at the edge of the tree line. Occasionally, lightning revealed it closer than before, always at the same distance, always still. By 1 a.m., I had realized something. The figure was reacting, not naturally, but it seemed to shift in response to me. When I moved to another window, it repositioned itself in a way that kept it at my periphery. I couldn't rationalize it. I've never believed in ghosts or monsters, but the logic didn't apply here. By 2 a.m., the water from the storm had begun seeping closer to the camper. Small mudslides threatened the foundation where I parked. I moved supplies inside, elevated anything that could be damaged. Every flash of lightning revealed the figure, closer again, always at the tree line, but never moving naturally. By 3 a.m., the storm was relentless. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. I kept checking the creek, the ridge, the figure. I realized the storm had trapped me completely. Roads were impassable. My phone had no signal. Any attempt to leave could be fatal. And the figure, it had not moved an inch since the storm began. By 4 a.m., I decided to observe systematically. I documented everything in writing, recording each movement of the storm, the water levels, the the position of the figure. It never left. When lightning struck, shadows revealed it in stark relief, pale, upright, human-shaped, with no discernible features. I tried to photograph it. Only blur appeared. By 5 a.m., exhaustion hit me physically. Hunger, cold, fear, anxiety, it all compounded. I considered screaming, calling for help, anything. But the sound would have been lost in the storm, and the figure would remain. I realized I wasn't afraid of a human being. I was afraid of something inhuman, something that existed outside the normal laws of the world. By 6 a.m., the storm began to taper slightly. Rain slowed, wind decreased, but the creek remained high. I cautiously stepped outside to inspect the damage. Mudslides had shifted the road slightly. Water had seeped into low areas around the camper, but nothing catastrophic. The figure was gone. I stayed in the camper until 10 a.m., documenting everything, recovering mentally, and waiting for sunlight to fully illuminate the hollow. No footprints, no trace of anyone else. The road back was treacherous, but I drove carefully, constantly checking the ridge and tree lane for movement. Back in town, I told a friend who was a local forestry ranger. He didn't dismiss it, only said, "There are places in the mountains where storms and isolation make people see things they can't explain, so don't make it back." I realized I was lucky to survive both the storm and the experience with the figure. Years later, I avoid the ridge entirely during storms. I avoid isolated roads and hollow trails. I still check weather reports obsessively. That night taught me that storms can be far more than rain, wind, or lightning. They can isolate, disorient, and expose you to things that exist outside human perception. I don't know what that figure was, if it was supernatural or something else entirely. I only know it stayed, waited, and observed as long as the storm raged. And I've never felt truly safe on a ridge during a storm since.